Edgar Allan Poe is one of the most well-known poets of the gothic fiction genre. The eerie and unsettling nature of the dark stories his writings convey capture the imagination and often leaves you needing to reread to fully grasp the concept. Two themes that are heavily present in a lot of his most popular works are that of the supernatural and the psychological, or more specifically for the intents of this video, the question of whether or not something supernatural is happening or if it is all in the broken mind of the narrator. In this video, I'm going to take a look at two of my favorite writings of his, The Raven and The Telltale Heart, and determine just what about them leaves a lasting impression, both on the supernatural theme and on the psychological side. We'll also take a look at the mysterious death of Mr. Poe, whose exit of this world was as mysterious and unnerving as his own writing. Let's first examine one of Poe's most well-known poems, titled The Raven. This poem is what the phrases of "quoth the raven" or "nevermore" are usually referencing. Like most poems, it uses rhyming words and flowing language to create a rhythmic-like feel of the reading whilst telling its story. Essentially, what the reader of this poem encounters is a lonely old man for a narrator, waking up from a drowsy nap whilst reading a book on a bleak December night. The narrator has recently lost someone very near to him named Lenore, who passed away sometime before the poem's taking place. The narrator tells us how he had begun reading in a vain attempt to forget his sorrow over the loss of this Lenore, and had been awoken by a tapping on his door. He figures it must just be a visitor who wished to see him. However, when he gets up and opens the door, no one is there. The old man immediately wants to think it had been Lenore from beyond the grave, the text reading that he was dreaming dreams no mortal had ever dared to dream before. When he closes the door, a tapping once again resumes, this time seeming to come to the window. Once again, he verbally assumes it must be something rational, like the wind, but when he opens his window, he is met by a singular black raven. The raven flies into his house and perches above the chamber door, and surprised by this, the narrator asks for its name, to which the raven actually replies with "nevermore." Marveling at this, the old man says to himself that surely this raven will fly away tomorrow, just as other birds have before, and many of his hopes will go with it. To this, the raven also replies, "nevermore." The old man returns to applying rationality to the situation by guessing that the raven had picked up this word from an old master. However, despite this, our narrator can't help but wonder if the word of this raven meant something greater, and he ends up sitting in front of it on the bust of his chamber door to stare at it. The presence of this raven seems to be weighing heavily on the narrator's mind, as he begins to deteriorate fast. He says the air began to feel denser, and he goes on a rant against the raven, claiming it was sent there by God to essentially torture him with memories of Lenore. He says, "Quaff, oh quaff this kind nepenthe, and forget this lost Lenore." To this, the raven once again replies, "nevermore." The narrator continues to lose it, screaming at the raven that it was a prophet of evil, and even calling it a devil. Despite this, he still continues to ask it questions, imploring whether or not there would ever be relief from the pain that he is feeling. Of course, the raven replies with "nevermore." The narrator then essentially asks if Lenore is with the angels in heaven, and, as always, the raven ominously says "nevermore." At this, the old man is furious and shrieks to the raven to leave, screaming that it has spoken lies and that he wishes for his loneliness to be left unbroken. Unsurprisingly, the raven just says "nevermore." The final section of the poem remarks how the raven remains sitting on his door, gazing at him with what the narrator describes as a demonic gaze, and that his soul shall be lifted from that shadow nevermore. So, in shortest terms, the poem tells a story about a lonely man who has suffered a great loss and begins losing his mind as a peculiar raven gives him a visit. But our question in particular is whether or not there was a supernatural presence. The old man certainly seemed to think so. Very early on, he considered the raven as a messenger from beyond, but quickly derailed into calling it a devil come to torment him. However, as you have probably concluded yourself, this old man is far from a reliable narrator. Seeing as he is in a deep state of grieving, a slipping mind is to be expected, which could account for a lot of his descriptions of the events that took place. For instance, When the raven first enters, the narrator doesn't describe it as some evil entity, or even being all that different from an ordinary raven at all. But as their time together progresses, and we see the narrator get progressively more belligerent, he begins describing it as demonic. I think this can be fully attributed to be in the mind of the narrator. Similarly so, the heavy atmosphere he begins to describe as he is spiraling. Two things that should be examined, though, are the phantom knock at the door and the speech of the raven. I think that the knock at the door can be discounted fairly easily. While it is the first event that begins to set the supernatural mood for the narrator, it could have been a simple trick of the wind, or perhaps the narrator had even mistaken the raven's initial taps at the window for raps on the door. In any case, I do think there are a few easy physical explanations for this supposed phantom knock. As for the speech of the raven, ominously repeating the word nevermore, it is possible that it could have learned to say that naturally during its life. Ravens are highly intelligent birds, and when they are in captivity, they can be taught to speak human words to a certain capacity, very similar to that of a parrot. With all of this being considered, I think we can debunk the possibility of a supernatural presence and instead contribute everything to the broken mind of our narrator. While it is somewhat coincidental that a raven that had specifically learned the word nevermore would fly into the house of a man who is suffering something that word could be so well attributed to, I feel all of the events fall within the realm of possibility without the aid of divine or demonic intervention. Even while it seemed that it was replying to the narrator's questions about Lenore to torture him with the fact that he was never going to see her again, the narrator kept asking questions even well after it was established that the raven could probably only reply with that one phrase. Thus, if the narrator does feel that the raven is torturing him over the loss of Lenore, it is his own fault for asking such questions to a creature that could only say nevermore. And I think that is what the poem is trying to convey. A man who has suffered a tragic loss and is now trapping himself within his mind in an endless loop of depression. Thus, I would have to label this poem as a grim psychological tale, rather than a supernatural one. However, it is undeniable that the tone and atmosphere of the poem does intentionally set up a very supernatural air to everything, and I suppose we could never truly know if there are divine forces at work. Now let's move into another work from Mr. Poe, this time the short story known as The Telltale Heart, where we will find similar themes. The story begins with the narrator assuring us that he hasn't gone mad. This is a point of fixation for him, and at multiple times throughout the tale, he is trying to convince us that he is of sound mind. The opening has the narrator describing to us how he had come to the conclusion to take the life of an old man. His motivation is strange. He explicitly states that the old man had done nothing to him to deserve this, and nor did he desire any of his possessions. Our narrator had to decide to kill him, simply because he did not like the look of this evil eye, as he called it, and wished to be free from its gaze forever. In another effort to assure us that he isn't insane, the protagonist describes the lengthy planning and precautions that he took in order to murder the man and get away with it. A few nights go by with the narrator attempting to kill the man in the dead of night, but finding himself unable to a few times because he couldn't see his eye while he slept, which was the primary motivation for his slaying. During these few nights, the narrator continually sneaks into the man's room, but does not end up killing him. What is extra terrifying about this is that during the days he would make friendly talk with the man, and I find the prospect of casually talking with someone who's on the verge of murdering you every night absolutely horrifying. On the 8th night, the old man actually wakes up during our narrator's visit, which leads to the narrator thinking that he can hear the man's heartbeats, his heart thrumming with terror. This heartbeat seems so loud to our narrator that he fears even a neighbor could hear it, and he decides that he must kill the man now. Dragging the old man to the floor, our narrator suffocates him with his own mattress by pressing it down upon him. Once again, the narrator stops to assure us that he still isn't mad, because he took the steps to hide the body so rationally. He dismembered the corpse in a tub to catch the blood, and hid the remains under the floorboards so carefully that there was no evidence to be found. Consequently, when the police arrive at the house later on due to reports of a shriek, the narrator is very confident that he is in no trouble at all. He is so confident that he is very nonchalant and talkative with the officers during their visit, but he soon finds himself talking with them in the very room that the old man's dismembered corpse lies under. During this time, the narrator begins to hear a familiar sound, the deafeningly loud beating of the dead man's heart. Try as he might, the narrator cannot ignore this, and is so tortured by the sound that he downright admits to the officers that he is the killer, and that they should tear up the floorboards to find the beating of this dead man's heart. And that's where the story ends. This one has a decidedly less supernatural feel than The Raven, and in fact, it is mostly about the sick mind of someone who finds joy at the prospect of killing someone. Throughout the story, the narrator expresses his excitement at the thought of the old man's fear and even great satisfaction at the thought of finally killing him. While the poem of The Raven was about the broken mind of a man going through loss, this short story was about the terrifying mind of someone who finds thrill in murder. The only real supernatural implication we get is the continued beating of a dead man's heart. However, just as I said for The Raven, I think this is due to the spiraling mind of our narrator. Even though it is well established that he was excited to kill this man, there must be some lingering guilt in him somewhere, especially due to the fact that he is obsessive about telling us that he isn't crazy. Furthermore, the police were with him in the room that he had stashed the body when he began hearing the heartbeat again. This would be a very tense situation, even to the most confident of killers, and the cops don't seem to react to the beating, suggesting that it is completely in the narrator's mind. I think due to his guilt, fear of being found out, and a general crazed state of his mind after becoming a murderer, the narrator was hallucinating the beating of the heart. This leads to him making a confession of the crime directly to the cops, which I think is an interesting way of showing someone so haunted by their sins that they'd rather face punishment for them rather than keep them hidden. As you can see, these two writings from Edgar Allan Poe share a similar nature. They depict tragic stories about two broken minds that make it appear as though supernatural forces are at work, but really are just peering into the dark recesses of the human psyche. This is just my interpretation though, and what I love about these stories is that they are somewhat ambiguous. The Raven could have been the embodiment of, or sent by some demon to torment the old man about his loss, and the beating of the dead man's heart could have been some power from beyond forcing the killer to face his sins. At the end of the day, the impact of a story is up to the reader, so definitely feel free to comment any thoughts you have down below. But there is one more mystery I'd like to take a look into before we wrap this video up, that being the circumstances that surround Mr. Poe's death. His life was pretty short and largely unhappy. He was already a heavy drinker when his young wife died of tuberculosis, and that just drove him even deeper into the bottle. A few years after this loss, he proposed to an old sweetheart of his in Richmond, Virginia. For some reason, he supposedly set out for Philadelphia, and his actions over the next few days remain uncertain. However, he was found slumped near an Irish pub by a passerby. He was in an extremely drunken state, but the weirdest part was his clothing. He was wearing very cheap clothes that barely fit him, which was a far cry from his usual black wool suit. He was admitted to a hospital where he supposedly babbled nonsense and suffered hallucinations. When he died, no death certificate was filed, but a newspaper dubbed his death as a result of congestion of the brain, which is taken as a euphemism for alcohol poisoning, although a physician at the hospital disagreed. That seems like it could very well be the cause of death, but the mystery comes in and around the strange circumstances. What was Poe up to during that few-day gap in which next to nothing is known? Why was the physician at the hospital convinced that Poe had not been drunk and had not been drinking in his final days? Even his time at the hospital, where he seemed to recover slightly then worsen dramatically, didn't feel consistent to alcohol poisoning. And of course, he was in and out of consciousness, rambling strange things the whole time. But weirdest of all, why was he found dressed the way he was? A theory on all this has emerged, and has to do with the violent practice known as cooping. Back in Poe's day, it was a commonplace to have voting take place in drinking establishments, and what would happen sometimes is gangs working for a corrupt politician would grab people and force them to vote in a certain way. Victims were often beaten to comply and forced to drink a lot, which would account for Poe's hurt and delusional state. Furthermore, they would also occasionally force their victims to wear disguises so that they could vote multiple times, changing their clothing. This would explain why Poe was found dressed so oddly. This is just a theory and hasn't been confirmed, but citywide elections were held in the place he was found, and the Irish pub he was found nearby did function as a voting station, so the theory does hold some weight. At the end of the day, there isn't quite enough evidence to fully decide what killed Edgar Allan Poe, and with the vagueness surrounding his last days, Poe departed from the earth with the same mysteriousness as the stories he wrote. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you're a fan of literature, perhaps consider checking out my self-published science fiction book series available on Amazon. This is currently a 5-book series with a 6th book underway, and you can even read the first book digitally completely for free. So if you like reading that genre, you can give it a try, and if you like it, you can find the rest of the books for purchase on Amazon, and if you don't really like it, well, it was free. Anyways, like and subscribe for more storyline-oriented videos, and until next time, it's been Playmaster.